So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to this webinar on the findings from our first work stream on basic project information for the DFI Transparency Initiative. My name is Gary Forster. I'm the Chief Executive here at Publish What You Fund in the UK. I'm joined by my colleagues Sally Paxton, who's based in Washington, DC, and Paul James, who's been the lead researcher on this work, based in London as well. We're looking to do a relatively brief presentation, maybe 20 minutes, and then leave some time for discussion. Please use the Q&A function for questions, and we'll take those at the end. I should also stay recorded from the start, just so that people know, and I'm also aware that we have received some questions in advance, so we'll try and cover those at the end as well. So in terms of what we're going to go through today, a quick introduction to the project for those of you who are not so familiar. We'll then go through the methodology that we've been using for this work stream on basic project information. We'll talk you through the findings, we'll share some of our conclusions, and then we can talk about the next steps, what we've got planned both for this research and then also the following work streams that are coming as part of this initiative, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So in terms of the project, in November 2019, Publish What You Fund embarked on this new initiative aimed at working collaboratively with development finance institutions and other stakeholders to increase the transparency of DFI investments. Through this 2.5-year project, we're looking at the use of public money by DFIs to meet global development goals. As more and more development aid is channeled through private institutions, we are using an evidence-based, multi-stakeholder approach to advocate for greater transparency and accountability of these investments. Scale of DFI finance is significant and growing. The annual non-sovereign private development investments by multilateral and bilateral DFIs has grown from $12 billion back in 2000 to $87 billion in 2017, and we know it's grown only more so since then. However, despite their rising prominence, very few DFIs share much information on their private sector portfolios, and this makes it both difficult to assess their development impact and to learn from different projects and approaches. Greater transparency can start to lay the foundation for more informed decision making, more accountability, and better allocation of resources, including information to assess the development impact of and learnings from DFI investments. When we launched the initiative back in November, we said we are aiming to have our effort be as collaborative as possible. In practice, that means we were kind of in listening mode for the first few months of the project. We reached out to a variety of stakeholders, including DFIs, civil society organisations, think tanks, private investment firms, and multilateral organisations such as the OECD to hear their views on how we should shape this initiative. So it was at the end of 2019 and early 2020 that we really got the project up and running. We then have a long research phase around 18 to 24 months throughout 2020 and 2021, where we'll be undertaking the bulk of the research. And then at the end of 2021, based on what we've learned, we'll be making a series of transparency recommendations. The project is guided by a project advisory board, which has the members that you can see on the screen. So that includes Rob Mosbacher, who is the former CEO of OPIC, Andrea Ordonez from the think tank Southern Voice, Aubrey Hrubry from the Africa Expert Network, Elizabeth Boggs-Davidson from SDG Impact, George Ingram from the Brookings Institution, Karen Finkelstein from IFC, Nancy Lee for the Centre for Global Development, Paddy Carter from CDC Group, and Paul O'Brien from Oxfam America. In terms of the work streams that we're going to be focusing on, the Project Advisory Board held its first meeting at the end of February, and its first task was to advise on the core areas on which the DFI Transparency Initiative should focus. So armed with research that our team had compiled, the board met to deliberate not only the core focus areas, but also the sequencing of these over the life of the project. After considering the advice of the board, we decided to proceed with the 5 work streams you can see on your screen, understanding that as the work progresses, we may need to adapt to opportunities and events and potentially amend the order and scope of various topics. So as you can see, the first work stream which we have completed and which you received the working paper from, which encompasses all of the research, is on basic project information. In the background, we're now working away on the second work stream on objectives, theories of change and impact. We'll be commencing towards the end of August, early September, the third work stream on environmental, social and governance and accountability to communities. And then later in the year, early next year, we'll be looking at work stream 4 on the value of the investment. So this is looking at concessionality, mobilization and the structure of the deals. And then finally, the fifth work stream will be looking at financial intermediaries, offshore financial centres and beneficial ownership. In terms of the basic project information stream, our definition for basic project information was essentially that information, the first tier of information that a data user will encounter when they look up a project. And we set out on this work stream with the aim of answering 3 research questions, essentially. First of all, how accessible is basic project information provided by DFIs? What basic project information do they publish? And what are the major gaps in project disclosure? We set out, each of these work streams is approximately 3 to 4 months. We set out in March with a landscape analysis and produced a draft report. And in the background undertook a bunch of interviews. So for each work stream, we set up an expert working group. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we also look to reach out as broadly as possible and speak to as many people from CSOs, from think tanks, from DFIs themselves, and from private investment houses. At the end of May, we held our expert working group meeting for this work stream, which was an opportunity for those experts to kind of critique our work, point out any omissions that we'd made and advise on areas that we could further focus on. And then in June, we sort of followed up on all of that feedback and produced the working paper, which was sent to you earlier this week. Like I say, for each work stream, we're setting up an expert working group of people who have specific expertise in that area. So for the first work stream, we were lucky to be joined by Alvino Wildshoot Prins from the Development Bank of Southern Africa, Andrea Ordonez, who was also on our project advisory board, but was sitting on this expert working group in that capacity from the think tank Southern Voice, Ben Leo from Frame, Cecile Ronaldo from Papaco, Giuseppe Nastasi from the European Investment Bank, Jolie Schwartz from the Bank Information Centre, Mimi Alameu from Black Rhino, and Nadia Nikolova from Allianz Global Investors. So again, they helped us throughout the course of the research, both in helping us understand the space a bit better, recommending organisations we should speak to, or examples of disclosure that we should investigate further, and then ultimately helped us in the discussion when we were calibrating our findings and making sure that we were kind of confident in what we'd identified in terms of the practices of different DFIs. So the landscape analysis, the objective was to understand what types of data fields DFIs disclose and how easy they are to access. And for this, we used a variety of sources. Some of them we were able to find ourselves, some of them we needed to contact the DFIs to check how to access them. But ultimately, we looked at website lists or databases, and that included downloadable databases, investment pages, project sheets, interactive maps, annual reports, but also IRT publication for those DFIs that are regular and sort of providing quality information to the International Aid Transparency Initiative. We also reviewed their publication efforts there. In terms of the DFIs we looked at, we've taken a sample of kind of the leading DFI organizations. So that includes 8 bilateral institutions, 9 sovereign and 9 non-sovereign multilaterals as well. So in some cases, those are the sovereign and non-sovereign portfolios of the same multilateral. In other cases, it's just that institution, depending on how it's investing its money. So we like to think we've got a pretty broad group of DFIs here that is somewhat representative for the purposes of this research. In terms of the data fields that we were looking into, and again, this kind of methodology was developed in discussion with various stakeholders, and based on what we found as we went along, it was quite an iterative process. But these are the data fields we concluded, so broken down into these 9 kind of subheadings of project identification, project narrative, location data, and the others you can see on your screen, and then within each subheading broken down into really specific fields of data that we were looking for. And as we've kind of said from the start with this initiative, we're looking to get as granular as possible. We recognize that great work has been done around promoting DFI transparency in terms of guidelines and principles and so forth, but there was definitely a need that was expressed to us from a variety of stakeholders to really get into the detail of, you know, if we're going to be talking about transparency here, what are the specific fields that we should be talking about. So in terms of the findings, and I'll just say now, and you'll have seen from the working paper that we have anonymized the DFIs, which we are reviewing in the project at this point. When we're checking DFI data back in terms of our findings and calibrating that with the individual organizations, we obviously aren't anonymizing at that stage because we want to make sure that that what we found is correct. But for the purposes of communicating the findings at this stage, our view is that what's actually important here isn't the performance of individual organizations at this stage, but rather what it tells us when you look at a bunch of DFIs as a group and see their various practices, and what that tells us about the feasibility of actually reforming transparency and getting more disclosure, for example, where individual organizations are able to share more information than others. So we have anonymized it for that reason. This page in front of you is just giving us an explanation of where we found or the data sources that were available to us from the various DFIs. So we haven't kind of ranked these. We haven't said that some data sources are better than others. We know from our own work that there are certain things that organizations look for when they're accessing data, and the ability to download bulk data in sort of CSV or Excel is admirable, or even obviously the publishing to the open data standard that is the IATI standard. But we haven't, for the purposes of this research so far, we haven't kind of put a value judgment on the utility of these various sources of data. We just wanted to present it here as a means of showing the different mechanisms that different organizations use. When it comes to the actual data fields, again, we've anonymized the DFIs here, but what is evident relatively quickly is that for almost every data field, there is an organization which is able to publish information against it. And this allowed us to then have discussions with the expert working group and with other stakeholders since then to say, is it feasible that we could actually have a more standardized or more harmonized approach across DFI to publish these data fields if there are already individual organizations that are able to do that. And that's very much help with our understanding of the barriers to further disclosure that exist. But it's also helped open some doors and provide some opportunities to talk about information that could be shared more consistently than it currently is. In terms of reform potential, this project is aiming to increase the transparency of DFIs and their investments. So what we've done here is we've assessed sort of disclosure at the group level. So we've got bilaterals, we've got multilaterals on the private side and multilaterals on the public side. And we've used this kind of traffic light system. So marking each data field as either green, whereby it represents kind of uniform or near uniform disclosure, orange, where it's kind of partial disclosure, or red, where it's kind of near uniform non-disclosure. And we've been able to kind of break it down and categorize each data field to produce this kind of hierarchy of reform potential. So where are those fields that actually the majority of DFIs are able to share data? Where are those fields where the majority are not currently sharing data? And then that's allowed us to start those discussions and really understand why that information isn't being shared. Is there an opportunity to do that? Are there concerns about it? Is it a systems issue? Is it a process issue? A number of DFIs have said to us, no, it's actually just about talking about having a kind of harmonized approach to this and knowing what it is that folks want to see in terms of information. So this table really shows where we think kind of the opportunities are in improving the sharing of data. And again, this is the first work stream of the whole DFI Transparency Initiative. So we've learned a lot going through this, and we'll be looking to work and build on the working paper that was sent out any comments on that are very welcome. And we look forward to, as the project continues, to improving the quality and accuracy of this, and using it to not only start those discussions with DFIs, but also to make those transparency recommendations towards the end of the project. In terms of our conclusions, there is a near universal trend towards improved transparency of basic project information by DFIs. Now, we know that because when we were looking at the data, we went back a number of years and we could see evidence on basic project information, and we're seeing something similar on the impact research now, that there is clearly a lot of effort being put in to increase the availability of information. I should say that for the purpose of workstream 1, much of the focus was on this kind of global level publication and sharing of data. Workstream 3, when we get to the kind of more community accountability aspects, we'll be looking at the sharing of data at that level as well. But for the time being, we've seen kind of investment and improvement in recent years in the disclosure of basic project information. We've seen a slightly higher degree of transparency at multilateral DFIs compared to the bilateral DFIs, and there's a number of sort of logical reasons for that, but then again, we need to be careful because each DFI is kind of unique in its own sense, and we don't want to draw any too broad brush conclusions. And then through our work, we've identified kind of 4 main reasons why data isn't being disclosed from our conversations with the various agencies that you've seen on the screen. So one is, fundamentally the administrative burden of disclosing information at a really granular level, and I think that's something we recognise and understand, and have to justify why this information is needed. Secondly, data fields are not always universally relevant. It depends on the types of investment, the mechanism and the funding that's being used, and the type of organisation that's making the investment. Thirdly, there's kind of definitional uncertainty and a lack of standardization. So one of the things that we learned pretty quickly as we were going through the research was the need to provide really clear definitions on each of those data fields to make sure that stakeholders knew exactly precisely what we were talking about at that point. And then fourthly, there's commercially sensitive information. Now, what we actually found with the basic project information workstream is that the amount of that is considered commercially sensitive is actually rather limited. With other work streams, it's coming up more frequently, and it's something we're kind of addressing as we go along. In terms of next steps, like I say, you've received the draft working paper. If you've signed up to this webinar, you should have received that yesterday. We are open to feedback on that and are looking to improve all the time. We're currently working on workstream 2, which is on objectives, theories of change and impacts. Again, we've set up our own expert working group or a unique expert working group for that workstream. And that sort of the conclusions of that research and that working paper will be ready sometime around the end of August. We'll do another webinar, seek more feedback, and let people know how we're getting on. Let me stop there and just ask my colleagues Sally and Paul, did I miss anything? Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Not at this point, Gary.
I think you covered everything, Gary.
Okay. In that case, we are open for questions. Please put them in the question and answer box. I also have some questions that were sent to us beforehand, so let me just pull those up a second. Okay, so we had a question that was submitted with the registration. Any plans of including tracking SDG or elements of ESG in the future? So we will be in workstream 3, we will be looking at ESG, and we'll be consulting widely to understand. We know a huge amount of work has been done on ESG disclosure, and we want to kind of build on that and understand what those kind of information fields and what that kind of process transparency needs are. To what extent that aligns with the SDGs, I think will allow the stakeholders to guide us. And when I say stakeholders, it is a broad mix that we're trying to consult at each stage. It's always a combination of DFIs, think tanks, and CSOs in the private sector. So we do feel like we're getting, hopefully, a fair reflection. But at the moment we will, so we will let you know, and we will see when we start that work stream. And we had another question, and forgive me for not reading out your names and your organizations. I don't know whether you wanted these to be confidential or not, but we had another question. How were the criteria for the basic project information arrived at? So like I said, it was kind of an iterative process by talking with different stakeholders about what kind of information they valued, and building kind of a framework from there. And then as we were actually conducting the research, if we identified areas that we've missed, we try and fill them in. Paul, did you want to add anything on how the criteria for the basic project information were developed?
So the main approach we used was essentially looking at defining it as the types of information you can find as the first tier of information when you search for projects, typically via the data sources which Gary identified earlier. So for example, if you were to use a database, and when you select a project in a database, you can access a document, an investment page or an investment sheet, which gives you a series of data fields. What we didn't do for this exercise was dive into kind of further attachments. So if there were ESG documents attached or appraisal documents attached, we didn't go into the kind of second tier of information. So we kept it as the kind of first tier of information. And then in terms of defining the actual the final 40 data fields, that was done via recording all of the data fields in an initial phase as they were titled on the various data sources, so on the websites, on the databases, and then using a kind of a form of best fit methodology to concentrating that down to 40 data fields and assessing which were present for each of the DFIs.
Thanks, Paul. So we've had a number of questions in through the chat and through the Q&A. So again, I'll keep this anonymous for those where they haven't. Okay, so there's one here. I understand the project includes financial intermediaries as a later work stream, but this first piece does not seem to address indirect lending at all. If it only covers direct lending, then this can be made clear. Then can this be made clear in the definition and methodology? Also, if it excludes, for example, 60% of IFC's portfolio, this needs to be clearly stated. Or if it is not excluded, then this also needs to be explained. At the moment, the omission of mentioning the significant part of DFI lending is puzzling. So really good point. I think we probably haven't covered off enough in the working paper our position on financial intermediaries at the moment. Financial intermediaries has taken up a disproportionate amount of the discussion, as you can imagine, for those who are familiar with how they work and their levels of traditionally their levels of disclosure. It's been discussed at length. The decision was to try and address all of the issues regarding financial intermediaries at the later stage in work stream 4, I think it is 5. But we ought to be clearer in the working paper about the logic behind that decision and its implications for the data that we reviewed to build this. So thank you. I think that's a really good point. And yeah, I think that's a really good point.
To be clear, the assessment which is included in the working paper doesn't include financial intermediaries. So we can be clearer about that in our methodology, I'm sure.
Yeah. And I think we should probably as well, because it's the first main research output, we'll put in there the rationale behind that at the moment. And it was there was no kind of perfect solution to the issue of financial intermediaries, but it was kind of agreed that we could maybe make headway on non-financial intermediary disclosure earlier on, and then focus on them in a later work stream. Is there a big difference between the different timelines and amount of projects you're assessing for each DFI? For instance, does the project compare the performance of some DFIs who have been working on this for many years compared to some who have only just started. If you're referring to DFIs that have only just started operating, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Paul, do you understand the question?
I will answer it to my interpretation of the question, if that's okay. So obviously there are some DFIs which are relatively new, in particular the ones we've surveyed, AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is a relatively new DFI, so there's a smaller portfolio. The approach that we took, and it wasn't designed to be kind of a scientifically rigorous, like kind of statistically rigorous mapping of what data was available, but the approach we took was to assess projects which were dated within the last 3 years, typically. So that was in recognition that if we looked back at old projects, for example, you could look at African development projects back to the 1960s on their database. If we were to do that, then obviously the transparency policies and disclosure practices would have changed significantly over time. So we inserted a threshold for how far back we would look at projects. In terms of numbers, as I say, it wasn't statistically significant. We viewed between 10 and 20 direct investments for each DFI to identify the data fields that they were publishing to.
Thanks, Paul. There's another question here. What type of participation have you been getting from the 3 different groups, i.e. bilateral, DFIs and MDBs on the private and sovereign side? Are you getting good participation? So far we are. This project was partly born from a recognition amongst DFIs themselves that they need to better communicate with each other in terms of how they disclose information about what they're learning from projects. They need to better communicate to their stakeholders in terms of the positive impact they're having, where they're having it, that they generally need to make information more available about what they're doing for a bunch of reasons. So I think a number of the DFIs definitely see this as a positive step after many years of agreeing to the guidelines and principles that have come through, which are all in the right direction. I think they recognize the need to get into the detail and talk about, okay, what are we actually going to be publishing here? And now, of course, the cynic in me might say, well, at the moment we've got great participation because we haven't actually asked for any major change, and those I'm sure will be coming in the later work streams. But yeah, no, so far the participation has been good. We have a question here. Can you tell us what are the different stakeholders? So there's the DFIs that we're engaging with. So the slide was on the screen, and it's 8 bilaterals and then 9 multilateral sovereign, 9 multilateral private. And then there's the project advisory board that we've established that oversees the project. There's the expert working group. And these are the ones that we've engaged with so far. And I'm very cautious because I can see a lot of the other questions that are coming through that which are completely validly asking, where is the role of the local stakeholders in this? Where are the recipient country governments? Where are community stakeholders? Where DFI investments are taking place? Where is their place in this? I see we have a question from International Accountability Project. I spent an hour on the phone this morning talking to somebody about your recent work on IDB Invest and the framework you used, and whether that's something that we can be using when we get to the accountability to communities part of this work. So we're very cognizant that at the moment, much of our engagement and discussion has been at the kind of the global HQ level, but we are aware of that, and our project advisory board and our expert working groups have continued to remind us of that, and we're feeling appropriate levels of pressure to make sure that we do address this other aspect, because you're absolutely right. The question here is, what has been the feedback from project affected communities? We haven't engaged at that level yet. So we need to do that, and we're very aware of the fact that the research could end up indicating that there is transparency from these organizations, whereas that might only be at the kind of global publication level and not at the practical grassroots level, which is where it's arguably more important. So that's something we're wrestling with. There's a question, is there any information or will there be regarding how the pandemic has affected DFI's investments? So not necessarily, because our discussions to date indicate that disclosure practices, again, and this is something we're wary of, disclosure practices at the global level haven't changed as a result of the pandemic. We know that a lot of investments are being fast-tracked and approvals are being fast-tracked, but our understanding is that the disclosure of those isn't. However, it's going to be a very different story when it comes to the kind of affected communities or the accountability to communities angle, and we're not sure of the answer to that. So that may well feature much more in workstream 3. But IAP and others, if I'm not sure who that question is from, it says anonymous, but if you're not from IAP or you're not aware, then International Accountability Project and others have the DFI COVID tracker, which is a part of the early warning system and is an extremely useful tool for identifying what's happening in terms of pandemic related investments and otherwise. There's a question here. I wanted to ask how this process measures change. Do you work with communities to see if they are receiving information prior to board approval by the DFIs? Hopefully I've covered that, and the answer is kind of not yet. But we are looking to make sure we get a balance in terms of how we define transparency between global level data publication and local level engagement around those same investments. Are you able to find out what are the rates of return between DFIs and FIs, and also between those same FIs and final users? So my sense is that that's going to come at a later stage when we get into the financial, the kind of compositions of the deals and what information is available. Paul, is that your understanding as well?
Can you repeat which question that was?
So in the Q&A, it's the final question. Are you able to find out what are the rates of return between DFIs and FIs, and also between those same FIs and final users?
Honestly, I couldn't answer that at this point. It might be something which becomes a question for workstream 4, which is looking at the structure of deals and the financial aspects of investment. At the basic project information level, there's not that level of information, I think it's fair to say.
So there's a question here. Are you also looking at what is published by the OECD on DFIs and multilateral development banks activities in support of sustainable development? So we are, in terms of two aspects. One is that we are in touch with a number of different groups in the OECD who are working on private finance, and whether it's the kind of the blended finance teams or the broader private finance teams, to make sure that we don't duplicate or overlap on any of the work that we're doing here. And then secondly, yeah, we're familiar with the DAC data and are trying to incorporate that, as we are with the IATI data sets as well, because we're not here to kind of recreate the wheel. We're here to see what's already being done and try and map that out. So to some extent, maybe we haven't been clear enough on that though in the working paper, how we are relating to those other data sets. So we will make a note to review that. Okay, and then there's another question here about there's a marked difference between the information available to communities prior to the approval of the project and all the decisions and after all the decisions have been made. Again, I think that's going to come up in workstream 3. And yeah, which is why, despite the work stream not starting for another month and a half, we were already having sort of meetings and discussions this morning to try and make sure we bring all the experts from that work from the community perspective to input into this initiative. Okay, and then someone said, sorry if I missed this, but is there a connection between this aspect of your work and the index that you publish? With the results of transparency or lack thereof influence the results of the index? So you're referring to the A Transparency Index there. We just produced the 2020 index just a few weeks ago. It did include 47 aid agencies globally, and a number of those were DFIs. At the moment, no, the aim of this is not to necessarily contribute to the index, I think we're too early in this process to understand to what extent it may be valuable or not to use the index to drive the change we're looking to seek. I think the important thing is figuring out what are the current practices, then what are the opportunities to improve, what are the barriers that might be in place that prevent us from improving disclosure across the board, and then how we tackle those barriers. So no, at the moment we're genuinely not thinking of merging the two. Sally, did you want to add anything on that?
Just to say that we do have room in our work plan for one additional work stream. So that is something that we wanted to kind of leave open to the extent that we get through the 5 work streams that we've identified and see what might be missing, what might need more information. We've also, we are also going to be looking at, are there potentially public goods that could come out of this, and the project will be looking at making recommendations. One of those could be, would an index be an appropriate public good at the end of this research and at the end of our recommendations for transparency? Is there some kind of a need for an anonymized database? So we have room near the end of our research to see what we might need to do in addition to these 5 work streams to round out the work that we're doing now.
Thanks, Sally. And then just having a quick look. So yeah, there's another recommendation here for people who want to check out the early warning system. And I think it's also a recommendation for us to make sure we review it again. This is International Accountability Project's early warning system, where they have a set of questions stroke sections that they use to analyze project information provided by DFIs. I know we did review, but we will make a point of going back and checking. Recommend everyone to take a look. And then again, and I think it is worth repeating this point, someone else saying that we need to be really clear on excluding intermediary lending, or at least on our position. So this is back to financial intermediaries, because it is such a substantial component of the IFC's portfolio, for example, EIBs, EBRDs. So we need to be very clear on what our position is on that and why, and then, yeah, the pressure is mounting to make sure we adequately address it when we get to the financial intermediaries work stream. But I think it's a good shout because we know that there's significant amounts of funding and vast numbers of projects which are extremely difficult to identify as a result. I think that is all of the questions that we've received at this time. You should have, sorry, Sally.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the discussions that we had at the very beginning of this project was how to deal with financial intermediaries, and whether we kind of wove those through every single work stream, or whether we actually tackled it on its own. So, and I think there were pros and cons with each of those approaches, and ultimately decided that probably dealing with it on its own was a better way to do that. So while a lot of your comments have brought some of these aspects out, those will be dealt with in our work stream on financial intermediaries. There are different ways you can cut this, and that was just the way that we thought would make the most sense, so that we could deal with all of these issues, and then at the end bring those together in a series of recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Look, I think that's all of the questions we have. Oh no, there's one. Sorry, there's one remaining. So, what plans do you have to follow up on these findings with the DFIs? So the first kind of follow-up is through those DFIs who are in the expert working group and the project advisory board. So we've had those discussions already for work stream 1. And then what we're doing is we're trying to build a slightly broader picture. So we're going to wait until we've got a couple more work streams complete to really identify where are the opportunities, because at the moment, at the rate we're going, we're identifying significant amounts of information, and we're going to have to somehow put some recommendations together that indicate the relative value of those different types of information and prioritize. It might be that over time we recommend a phased approach to bringing in better disclosure with regards to specific bits of information which are valued higher in the first instance. But we have open dialogue with pretty much all of the organizations that you saw on the screen. And you know, these findings aren't frustrating them or shocking them or scaring them into an expectation that we're going to start asking for all this information. I think they are appreciative that someone's doing the mapping. They're interested to learn what other DFIs are doing. And then the question is, you know, what's feasible in what kind of timeframes and so on. But again, recognizing that we have really been I've lost my train of thought, but we've had a question come in. Can we put the list of DFIs up on the screen? So I will just quickly go back. So these are the organizations that we have been collecting data on so far, and that we've been trying to engage with. And while we haven't been completely successful in every single one of them, I'm pretty confident we've spoken to most already. And we share their data. Well, once we've done the analysis of what information they're sharing, we share that back with them, so that they have the opportunity to kind of comment and say, oh, actually, you missed this data source, or, you know, this wasn't available at that time, and so on. So again, the point isn't necessarily to get extremely forensic, and at this moment in time, it's really to highlight at a broader level what's possible in terms of disclosure. And therefore, when we get to the recommendations phase, and if we're talking about standards or harmonization or better practice, then we'll be much better informed. Okay, we have one other question. Was there any discussion on additionality and whether DFIs collect information that proves they are additional, not crowding out when they make an investment? So this is something that we've discussed at length as part of workstream 2 on impact. So additionality is covered there in terms of the definitions that DFIs use for additionality, how they themselves calculate it, whether the data is, you know, what the process of calculation looks like, and whether the data is available on the kind of conclusions or the impact related to additionality. There's a lot of, without going into it too far because we're still finalizing the research, there's quite a variance in how people, how DFIs think about and measure and define additionality. And I think our research is really helping to highlight that, and hopefully can be the start of a conversation around getting a more consistent approach to it. Yeah. Okay, I think that is all of the questions for now. The email addresses are on the screens. If you've got any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. Genuinely, we are looking to have as much input from as broad a range of stakeholders as possible. This project will continue for almost the next couple of years as we continue on the research. We'll try and engage with everybody who's joined, but please do not hesitate to reach out or to recommend work that's already been done or being done in this space, so that we can try and build as much momentum towards better disclosure as possible. And we, and we'll leave it there. There's one final question. What is the next step for this? How will this be linked to other work streams? So you will receive an invitation to the next work stream by virtue of the fact that you've joined this webinar. If I've just said that without checking if that's GDPR compliant, what I've just said, but we will make sure that we try and reach out to people, and we will keep you up to date with the research as it's going. We'll be sharing the working papers. But as we said before, the main conclusion is looking towards these transparency recommendations that will come at the end of the research phase. I'll just check in with Sally or Paul to see if they had anything else to say.
Yeah, just to reiterate that all of this is essentially gathering the evidence that we want to have that will then inform the transparency recommendations that will come out at the end of the research phase, and then we will start to publicize those, to put those out to see what kind of change we can make with respect to transparency. So we're really now in the evidence building stage, and then we'll go out to with our recommendations to DFIs, to all the other stakeholders, to policymakers, and see how much uptake we can get on these recommendations.
Right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. It's great to see so many people interested. So we'll be back in the next few months with a similar session, but this time on impact. So it just leaves me to say thank you to Sally and Paul for joining us. Thank you, everybody else. Have a good day.